which leads to our last question, which is based on the fact that in late January, so a few weeks ago, there was a big demonstration in Argentina against Javier Milei, the libertarian president of Argentina, and it was a feminist, trans-feminist-led demonstration. It was huge, and the slogan was remarkable because the slogan drew on something that both Trump and Milei love to say: there are only two genders. And the slogan of the demonstration was, there are indeed only two genders, fascist and anti-fascist. and so this leads to a double question. The first one, to which you have in part responded, but maybe a little more rumination could come with it. Is it fascism? Mm-hmm. What we're experiencing here, what they experience in Argentina, what is growing very quickly in Europe right now, what we have with Modi, what we have with Erdogan, what we have in Israel, and so forth. Is it fascism? Is that the right word? Because some people, from Biden to others, talk about oligarchy rather than fascism. Mm-hmm. So how these two can be articulated. So that's one question. But another question, which is probably more interesting than the definition of is it fascism, is it not, is regardless of how you answer that question, do you think that anti-fascism is the right perspective and the right approach? Mm-hmm. Not to actually draw a program, but to start the resistance mm-hmm. to what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I agree with you that the question of how to define this moment, or whether it's fascist or not, is can be a narrow and limited way of trying to understand the ground that we're on. I do think it's worthwhile to draw on past examples of fascism for what it can teach us and what it can show us, and what, where we see resonances. And there are so many. There is part of my hesitance, and I'm sure it's part of your hesitance, is that there can be kind of kind of a liberal hysteria around that term, which is kind of like a kind of a mid-20th century liberal vision of Nazi Germany, right? And which promotes the American regime and liberal democracy as itself something that is worthwhile. One way that I answer that question sometimes is to say that we have to really look at what's old and what's new, and that there are, as I already outlined, there is there are forms of hierarchy and domination rooted in gender and race and class that are just this one logical conclusion of which is Trumpism. There are specific modes of anti-democratic and white supremacist and pro-market politics in the Republican Party, which start with Goldwater in '64 and move forward to this moment. So there's something there as a shorter history, but one that's a very consequential one, which brings us to this moment of fascism. And then there's something about the novelty of this moment where we are now, which is inflected by many things that I answered in the last question, which we have to kind of sort through. In the American regime, it's a federalist system, and there's a lot that can happen at the local and state level, and there's forms of resistance that can happen there, and it's a big country, and it's not so easy just to have regimented forms of authoritarian rule, and we should remember that there's many different resistance can take many forms. In terms of, I think I less think of like globally that we have some kind of unified march to fascism than a retreat from democracy, right? Which then there's many kinds of authoritarian rule. There's many kinds, whether it's oligarchic or fascist or kind of Caesarist forms of authoritarianism. All that's being expressed on the world stage. But what's, it comes in the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the decolonial, anti-colonial struggles, and the possibility of like non-aligned internationalism of, that was through Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America and Asia, and through a series of defeats that buoyed any possibilities of democracy have kind of been played out. But it leaves us in a place where democracy has very few resources to draw on in the face of growing authoritarianism. So, in democracies, in substantive democracies' absence, we see the growth of these things in different ways, in different forms, I think, across the globe. Some of them are, colonialist in nature, like in Israel. Some of them draw on forms of authoritarianism in Soviet Union, which is both Soviet and Tsarist, But in any case, so I say that partly to set up to your second question, like, is anti-fascism the way to, is a proper mode of resistance? And I guess partly it would depend on what, when I think of anti-fascism, when I was younger, I would think of anti-fascism as, my vision of it would be the FAI and CNT and Spain, and I would think of Barcelona in 1936, And it's because that form of anti-fascism was anti-authoritarian, and it was anarchist, and it was collectivist, and brought into practice new forms of democratic decision-making and new forms of popular sovereignty, which opened up all kinds of other social and cultural possibilities and individual possibilities for liberation along with it. And so there's a part of me that really deeply holds on to that. I think there are elements of spontaneous, anti-colonial resistance and anti-racist resistance versions of in the developed world context. I think of for me, one of the models is the Black liberation and radical feminism here in the late 60s and early 1970s. In the UK, I think of the massive anti-police riots that spread across the UK in 79, 1980, 1981, led by Caribbean and South Asian migrants who then, these movements were joined by white British subjects, and it developed solidarity with people in Northern Ireland, and as partly a multinational movement which had connections in Grenada and in Africa and elsewhere. I think so. The question of what I guess I believe in an anti-fascist politics, a politics of resistance and disruption and deep institutional distrust. But I also believe in, as part of that, is building new collective forms of resistance, and which is also about building new forms of meaning and connection with each other, which I think we need. We have to nurture political cultures which are that people do through music and theater and food and other forms of creativity and mutuality and care. And I'm not sure that's enough, but it may be that what we're headed into is a long crisis, which is an ecological crisis and an economic crisis and a global militarized crisis, that perhaps the best we can do is find and build modes of resistance that may take many decades to come to fruition. But I don't think we get there through liberal politics, and I don't think we get there through the Democratic Party, and I don't think we get there through, a collection of sectarian organizations on the left that imagine they speak for the working class. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's.
No, it's a very hopeful note to end the whole.
You always have to end these things on a hopeful note. Like no matter how grim it gets, it's like every article in a socialist magazine always has to end with the possibility of the international proletariat coming in.
You just said we were not there.
Yes,
We clearly are not there. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for such great questions, and it's a privilege to be able to just talk like this too.